The sun shone brightly over the United States Marine Corps base, where the daily routine of military life unfolded with its usual precision and vigor. This was a place of discipline, but also a place where human stories intertwined in the most unexpected ways. At the heart of this world were two men who could not be more different: the boisterous and often exasperated Sergeant Carter and the ever-optimistic, wide-eyed Private Gomer Pyle. Their relationship was the stuff of legend, a constant tug-of-war between military rigidity and country's simple sincerity. On this particular afternoon, the atmosphere in the non-commissioned officers' club was thick with the scent of coffee and the sound of shuffling cards. Sergeant Carter was engaged in a game of poker with his fellow sergeants, including the wily Sergeant Hacker. The game was more than just a pastime. It was a theater for their egos and a testing ground for their patience. Sergeant Hacker had just finished listening to one of his men pour out his heart, and he was leaning back with a self-satisfied smirk on his face. Sergeant Hacker looked over at his friend and rival, urging him to take it easy and relax. He had just spent 10 minutes acting as a sort of informal counselor to a young Marine, and he felt quite proud of his paternal approach. He told Vince Carter that he should let the boy sleep on his problem and talk again tomorrow, expressing confidence that everything would work out. Carter, however, was not impressed. He asked Hacker if he was trying to be the chaplain. Hacker defended himself, stating that whenever his boys had a problem, they came running to him because he was their father image. Carter scoffed at the idea, telling Hacker to just play the cards and stop acting like a parent. As the game progressed, Carter suspected Hacker of cheating, accusing him of looking at the cards. Hacker denied it with a grin, calling for a new deal. Carter protested, claiming he had a good hand, but Hacker insisted on starting over. This bickering was typical, but the conversation soon shifted to the nature of leadership and the relationship a sergeant has with his men. Sergeant Hacker mused that listening to troubles was all part of the job, a form of rapport that he believed he possessed in abundance. He suggested that Carter, unfortunately, lacked this special connection with his platoon. This hit a nerve with Carter. He insisted that he had just as much rapport as anyone else. Hacker challenged him, asking if his men ever confided in him or came to him with personal problems. Carter retorted that he was a sergeant, not an advice columnist, but Hacker maintained that a leader should use his experience to guide his men. The tension between the two grew until Hacker made a bold claim. He bet Carter $50 that he could not go 24 hours without losing his temper. Carter, confident in his professional discipline, accepted the wager. He was determined to prove that he was in full and complete control of himself. The bet was set to end at 1700 hours the following day. Hacker warned him that he and his boys would be watching and listening for any sign of an explosion. The next morning, Sergeant Carter stood before his platoon, determined to demonstrate his newfound patience and rapport. He called the men to attention and invited anyone with a personal problem to step forward and discuss it with him. He wanted to prove he was older, wiser, and ready to listen. The Marines stood in stunned silence. They were used to a sergeant who barked orders, not one who offered a shoulder to cry on. Finally, Gomer Pyle stepped forward. Pyle followed Carter into the duty hut, looking slightly embarrassed. He explained that he had a personal matter he had never discussed with anyone else. Carter, trying his best to remain calm and welcoming, encouraged him to speak. Pyle began a long, detailed explanation about his teeth. He told the sergeant that his dentist had informed him he had an undibite. It was not a severe case, but it could be corrected with a dental retainer. Pyle described the retainer in exhaustive detail, mentioning the steel wires and the strap that would go around his neck. He explained that he would only have to wear it at night, but he was worried about the bother and the long duration of the treatment. He looked at Carter with genuine concern, asking for his professional opinion on whether he should go through with it. The old Sergeant Carter started to feel the familiar heat of irritation rising in his chest. He found the topic of an underbite utterly ridiculous in a military context. He eventually snapped, telling Pyle to get out and not to bother him with such stupid problems. He shouted that he was a sergeant, not a dentist. Hacker, who had been eavesdropping, stepped in with a knowing smile, reminding Carter that he had already lost his patience. However, the bet was not over yet. Carter insisted he had not truly lost his temper, just expressed a firm opinion. Hacker decided to turn up the heat. He realized that Gomer Pyle was his greatest weapon in winning the $50. Hacker found Pyle later and pretended to be interested in his dental dilemma. He suggested that Carter actually missed their father and son talks and that Pyle should try talking to him again. He convinced the innocent Pyle that Carter was a creative man who just did not like his train of thought interrupted. Encouraged by Hacker, Pyle approached Carter again. This time, he found the sergeant trying to maintain his composure. Pyle apologized for interrupting his train of thought and went back into the details of the underbite. He mentioned how it affected his ability to chew corn and that he was always the last one to finish a meal. Carter, gritting his teeth, told Pyle to just get the retainer and make an appointment, desperately trying to end the conversation before he exploded. As the hours ticked by, the pressure on Sergeant Carter increased. He was suffering from physical cramps from the sheer effort of holding back his natural urge to yell. He tried to avoid Pyle at all costs. He even managed to stay calm when Pyle accidentally knocked over his prized ceremonial sword, a souvenir he claimed to have captured from an enemy officer during the Incheon landing. Pyle was horrified, but Carter simply took a deep breath and said it was his own fault for not watching where he was going. Sergeant Hacker, seeing that Carter was holding out longer than expected, decided on a final, more drastic plan. He told Pyle that Carter's stress was mental, not physical, and that he needed a shock to release the tension. Hacker suggested that Pyle should break Carter's sword in front of him to provide a therapeutic jolt. He promised Pyle that he would substitute the real sword with a cheap fake so that no actual damage would be done. Pyle, wanting only to help his beloved sergeant, agreed to the plan. He entered the duty hut, picked up the sword, and snapped it in two right before Carter's eyes. Carter was momentarily speechless. Pyle explained that he was doing it for Carter's own good, to help him let off steam. He then told Carter that Hacker had substituted the sword with a fake. The truth came out when Carter realized that Hacker had lied to Pyle. There had been no substitution. The broken sword was indeed the original. However, Carter also realized that Hacker had used Pyle to try and win the bet. Instead of exploding with rage, Carter felt a strange sense of victory. He told Pyle that he had won the bet because he had remained in control despite the provocation. He even confessed that he had not actually captured the sword in battle, but had won it in a card game, so its destruction was not the tragedy it seemed. In the final minutes of the 24-hour period, Sergeant Carter felt he had the upper hand. But then, Corporal Jensen arrived with a message. He told Carter that Sergeant Hacker had conceded the bet and had sent an official note of payment. Pyle handed Carter a piece of paper, which Carter assumed was the $50. Instead, it was an informal IOU note. At that moment, the 24 hours were almost up. Seeing the worthless piece of paper after all the torment he had endured was the final straw. Sergeant Carter finally let out a thunderous roar, screaming at Pyle for accepting a piece of paper instead of cash and telling him to get out of his life. Sergeant Hacker walked in, laughing, and collected his $50, pointing out that Carter had failed with only 5 minutes to spare. He mocked Carter for being an amateur compared to an old pro like himself. However, Gomer Pyle, in his characteristic simplicity, pointed out something important. Since Hacker had given an IOU for $50 to Carter earlier to settle the bet, and then Carter had paid $50 in cash to Hacker for losing, the two debts canceled each other out. In the end, nobody won and nobody lost. Pyle remarked that this was the best kind of gambling because everyone was back where they started. As Sergeant Hacker stood there, realizing he had not actually made a profit, he began to feel a bit of a stomach ache himself. Gomer, ever helpful, leaned in and asked if the pain might be mental rather than physical, offering to help him find some rapport. The bass returned to its usual rhythm, with the lessons of patience, honesty, and the unique friendship between a sergeant and his private lingering in the air.